Throughout history, humans have been migrating across continents in search of a better or perhaps a different way of life, with many landing on our shores from continental Europe or beyond. And examples over the last few thousand years would include the Celtic peoples from the Iron Age period, who went on to build their tribal kingdoms all the way across the British Isles, including here in Essex. And then in 43 they were followed by the Romans, who came with their military might and their towns and cities. And then, of course, they were followed by the Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans, Flemish cloth workers, and we could go on, many, many more. But all of them left their indelible mark, not only on our landscape, but on our way of life. Nearly 2,000 years ago, hundreds of Roman ships appeared on the English coast, and on board were builders, traders and soldiers, and they brought with them their crafts and their languages. And the Romans built their first legionary fortress in Colchester. Colchester then was known as Camulodunum, and it was the first legionary fortress in Britain. And later on it was converted into a Roman colonia, which was a city of the highest rank, and it became the first city of Roman Britain. And far from being just a quiet corner of the map, Essex was to find itself in the middle of something much bigger.
The Romans essentially founded the town of Colchester and built a lot of the infrastructure that led to where the modern town sits today. That could include roads, which follow some of the same alignments as the Roman roads. It includes some of the walls, which you can still see today in the town. And even the foundations where we're standing right now, underneath Colchester Castle, they were built by the Romans about 2,000 years ago.
So the Roman invasion on Britain had a big impact on Essex. They founded Colchester, first as a fortress, part of the network of defences to keep them established in Britain, to resist the resistance from the locals. And they also built roads. Roads are really important. Some of the roads, the main roads, would have followed pre-existing trackways, pre-Roman trackways, but the Romans built roads. They built good roads, metal roads, trained roads, and they went in straight lines in the shortest distance. And in Colchester, initially you had 6,000 soldiers based, where there was not very much before. There was a settlement before, but not with 6,000 people, all armed to the teeth, all trained, fortifying this grip that the Romans had in the area.
So as the Roman Empire was, people could have come from all over the place. So some of them would have come from Rome itself, maybe. Definitely people came from Italy, but people would have come from any province that was part of the Roman Empire. So one of the great things about the empire was that it allowed for travel between provinces quite easily. So we know in Britain specifically, we have people from Egypt, we have people from North Africa in general, we have people from the Near East, we have people from Spain, Italy, Greece. And we know this through a variety of different sources. We know this through the objects and the writing that has been found, but we also know this through the bones of the people that have been found here.
Well, they chose Colchester because it was the obvious choice. They wanted to invade Britain. The way to do it was to cross the Channel. The nearest way to get from the continent to Colchester was across the Channel into what is now Kent, and then across what is now Essex. They headed straight for the main centre of opposition, which at that time was the Catavaloni, which was a British tribe, which had originated actually from northwestern France, what is now France. And they had themselves crossed earlier, which is a normal pattern, people coming from the continent and settling in Britain.
So in the early days, when the Romans first arrived here, the big kind of thing about Roman Empire was bringing people in to the Roman kind of belief system. So that would include giving new gods to the people in the countries they conquered, but also including those local gods in their own religion. So what would often happen is you get this thing called syncretism. So that's where you have a god that's Roman and a god that's local to the province that they've conquered, and they sort of mash them up together. So you have examples at places like Bath, where you have Sulis Minerva. Sulis was the local deity and Minerva was the Roman goddess of war and wisdom. And they were just sort of mashed together to create one new deity to kind of act as a unification between the two religions.
They recruited soldiers from all over the Roman Empire, which extended right beyond the far end of the Mediterranean. You wouldn't raise a unit, say in Britain, and base it in Britain, you put it somewhere else. So they moved people around in a way and mixed them all up over a big area. And then after 25 years, which is a normal period for your legionary, the person would retire. And they would then be given the chance to stay in the same country and they begin as a pension. And that is what happened in Colchester. It would have happened.
Latin was kind of the official language of the Roman Empire. Greek was also an official language. Lots of Roman citizens would have spoken Greek as well as Latin, quite well actually. But there would have also been many other languages. So Britain would have had its own language before the Romans arrived. Unfortunately, that wasn't ever recorded, so we don't really know what that was like. But other countries, other provinces that were conquered by the Romans, they also would have had their own languages, whether that's Egyptian, that could have been the languages of Central Europe, the languages of Spain, and other parts of North Africa.
The archaeological record, in terms of migration, has got lots of bits of evidence that can be looked at, and has been looked at. And one of them is DNA. Also, we find lots of objects which are imported as well in the graves, which suggest, again, movement of people.
Some of the things that the Romans brought to Britain included new plants, new food, rabbits, we believe, were introduced at the time of the Romans. And that is a legacy we still have today. If you look in the countryside, there are rabbits everywhere, at least in some parts. They introduced, through this food, a new lifestyle, a new way of cooking, eating. They introduced a whole host of different forms of entertainment, things like theatre. Although they may have had performance before the Romans arrived, we know from some accounts that they had this tradition of, a bit like bards, people who would travel telling stories and singing, things like that. This idea of mass gatherings in a large seated building and watching plays didn't exist before the Romans arrived. And that extends also to the amphitheatre, where watching gladiatorial combat and seeing people executed publicly probably didn't exist in that format until the Romans arrived. They had a huge kind of impact on the way in which people would have lived basically through the infrastructure that they provided. The buildings and the town that existed before the Romans arrived would have been quite open, a lot of things made of wood and plaster. The Romans introduced brick and concrete, which creates a more stable, long-term buildings and things for people to live in, to work in, to perform in. And so that was one of the things that they built. And although that sort of disappeared when the Romans left, some of those features still survive to this day. So that's how we see that legacy of the Roman impact in Britain. When the Romans officially conquered Britain in AD 43, there was already quite a long-standing relationship with the people of Britain. So they'd been trading for almost a century since Julius Caesar first tried to conquer, almost 100 years before. So there'd been a lot of contact, a lot of trade, a lot of communication. People were already starting to adopt Roman customs. We know that wine started to be drunk in Britain before the official start of Roman Britain, and that was because we find evidence of amphorae and other things that suggest that wine was brought here before then. We know that people started to have similar beliefs, and you even get evidence of coinage and other things coming over to Britain before the Romans officially called Britain their province.
The Roman administration was withdrawn from Britain in the first part of the 5th century. And it was done by the Roman authorities back home. And it was a decision made because they weren't in a position, they felt, to protect all the different provinces.
So by that point, the people who had been native to Britain beforehand had essentially assimilated into Roman lifestyle. So they were considered as Roman. Everyone living in Britain at that time was Roman. So what we have in 410, when the Romans officially withdraw, is a military withdrawal. So the soldiers are gone, but the people living here were still Roman. They probably considered themselves Roman and would have come from the original Roman settlers and their families who arrived here, as well as others who had arrived in the 400 years since the first Romans arrived in Britain. They would have stayed. Once the army left, they would have continued living in Britain. They would have continued living in Colchester. They saw this as their home. They had no need to leave. The Roman army left not because of a threat here, because of a threat back in Rome. So they possibly would have expected the Romans to return, but that never happened. And what actually happened was about 40 years later, the Anglo-Saxons arrived and posed a whole new threat to the type of lifestyle that they were living here in Britain. Now, as we know, the Anglo-Saxons coming from northwest Europe, probably quite different culturally to the people of the Roman Empire, who would have come from all over Europe and North Africa. So it would have been quite a cultural shock probably to the Anglo-Saxons when they arrived to see such diversity within Britain. We know that there were people living here later on in the Roman period from some of those places, North Africa, etc. We know this through the study of human remains. So isotopic analysis tells us that at least where people came from, whether they spent their entire lives there or not. So we know that a lot of people, even in Colchester, we know that a lot of people weren't local. They came from plenty of other places. Whereas for the Anglo-Saxons, perhaps, although they were travelling and invading other places themselves, it's assumed that a lot of their, at least from where they come from, a lot of the people were culturally similar. And so they were taken over places that were culturally diverse. So that will be quite an interesting mix to see once the Anglo-Saxon period starts. So it had changed massively in terms of kind of the belief system that most people would have followed, although there were likely people still believing the old ways of Roman pagan religion. But it would have been a completely different society at the end as to what it was when the Romans first came here.
I'm standing in Colchester High Street now, which has been at the heart of our local community, stretching back 2,000 years to when the Romans came, right the way through the centuries to our present day. But what I'm going to share with you now is a particular episode in the town's history that brought great wealth and prosperity to the town. And to do that, we're going to move away from the High Street into an area which is known locally as the Dutch Quarter. It's called the Dutch Quarter after a number of Flemish refugees arrived here from the 1560s. And these refugees were escaping from religious persecution where they came from in what was then called the Spanish Netherlands. And it was owned by the King of Spain. And he was trying to get all of the people in his territories to convert to Catholicism. And these Protestants, they were being persecuted, they were being beaten, they were being tortured, and some were being executed. And many of them decided they literally had to flee for their lives, had to leave everything behind. And many of them came across the Channel to England and settled in many of the towns on the eastern side of Britain. Now, the interesting thing is the bailiffs of Colchester at that time, they almost begged these refugees to come and settle here. And you might think, well, why would they do that? That they even petitioned the Queen's Privy Council saying, can we have permission for these people to come? Because we think they'll be industrious. And the reason why they wanted them to come here, because they knew that they were expert cloth makers. And based on the arrival of these Flemish refugees, Colchester prospered greatly for the next 2 centuries. One of the many privileges given to the new Dutch immigrants was they were put in control of the manufacture of bays in Colchester. So every single bay that was made, they got to inspect it and check it that everything was okay. And they were also given the opportunity to open up their own Dutch Bay Hall, which stood on the site of the building you can see behind me, which is now the fire office. When it was completely finished and packed up and it went to its destination, which was mainly in countries of Southern Europe, The buyers apparently, all they had to do was see these Dutch-based seals on the cloth, and that was like a byword of quality for them. They didn't need to inspect it any further. Apart from the survival of several houses here in the Dutch Quarter, where the Dutch immigrants would have lived, and several street names in the town that refer to the bay trade, there's very little actually that you can see in the town that shows any proof that the bay trade ever existed. And yet there is one special little feature in St Martin's churchyard, and why I brought you here, I'd like to show you a very interesting gravestone which is here in front of me. Here lies interred the body of Jacob, or should that be Jacob Ringer, Bay's maker, who departed this life January the 20th in the year 1680. So here we've got evidence of a bay maker on display in the town. When it says bay maker, he could have been a weaver, he could have been doing some of the other activities, or he may have been an employer employing lots of other weavers himself. The making of bay cloth involved numerous processes and activities, and it's been said that to support the bay trade in Colchester, at least 20,000 people were involved. From the start, the wool has got to be cleaned and sorted, it has to be untangled, and this involves either combing or carding the wool. And in the case of bays, they had to do both, because part of the thread was woolen, part was worsted. And once that had been done and that was nice and fine, it would be passed on to the spinners, thousands of spinners, some of them the other side of the county, just thousands were employed. They had to spin the yarn for the weavers. The weavers would then weave the cloth, and each bay cloth was something between 42 and 48 yards long and about 2 yards wide. And it's been said that each weaver could weave about 5 yards in a day. And then of course, after it's been fulled, and it's wet, it's been wet in the water wheel, it's all been soaking wet, it has to be dried out on the tenter frames, which in the field behind me is where many of them were located. Once the cloth had been woven, it had to go to the fulling mills, and what they would do, they would pile it up on the floor. Don't forget, these are quite long, these are like 40 yards long, and they would sprinkle it with urine, stale human urine and water. And they got the urine by going around people's houses and paying them a penny a pail or so for their urine. And then once they had sprinkled it and it had heated up, they would put this cloth under the fulling stocks, and the cloth would be pounded by these massive great mallets or hammers, which was attached to the water wheel, and it would pound them for a certain amount of time. And what it actually did, it scoured the cloth and degreased it, and at the same time thickened it. So it kind of tightened up all the threads. And then once it's finished, it had to be cleaned, it'd give it a good old wash in the mill pond or in the river. And now, of course, it's completely soaking wet, so it has to be dried by hanging it on these tenter frames that I mentioned earlier. And virtually every field in Colchester, every spare bit of garden land, and you can see this on the old maps, was full of tenter frames, including this very field that we're walking on now. This is a view from a prospect of Colchester dated 1724. But it shows you a lovely example of some of these tenter frames. We're now standing outside Bourne Pond Mill, and this is the very last of the bay making mills, fulling mills in Colchester. It closed down in the 1830s, and at the time it was being run by Mr. Peter Duval. And several of the workers who worked at the mill in that time, in the 1820s and 1830s, survived into old age, and they were interviewed by a man called Dr. Henry Laver. Charles Baker, who was about 80 years of age, and he had quite a bit to say about his work as a fuller, fulling the cloth at this mill. I was born in Colchester in 1718, and when I was 9 years old in 1826, I went to work at Bourne Pond Mill, which was then owned by Mr. Peter Duval, a master bay maker who lived in Priory Street just below St James Church. At the mill, I helped with a number of the various processes, including fulling of the cloth. This was the final process associated with the trade, and we carried it on like this. We folded a piece of bay on the floor so that it made a pile about a yard square, and as we did so, we sprinkled it with chamber lye, urine. We used to go around the workhouses and other places to collect the chamber lye, for which we paid a halfpenny a pail. By the following morning, the bays had heated. We then took these and put them 2 or 3 pieces at a time under the fulling stocks, large wooden beams which rubbed them in a certain way, thus fulling or thickening them. The rubbing process continued for about half an hour, after which a good stream of water was turned on the bays to wash them. We used to make the water very foul in fulling. I have seen distillery pond quite white after we had done. As Europe darkened in the years leading up to the Second World War, thousands of Jewish children were sent abroad to find safety somewhere. Many of them arrived in Britain through this quiet port here at Harwich. Many were taken in by British families, but sadly some of those children would never see their families or parents again. Here in Essex, many found the opportunity to start again, even if it was without the ones that they loved.
When Hitler came to power, he was convinced the Jewish nation was the fault of everything. He was completely mad and was obsessed by persecuting the Jews. In the early days, people who had jobs in banks and things, they were just sacked. Children who went to school were banned from school. And the further it went on and on, the Jewish organizations within Europe knew there was something really going to happen. What really kicked it off was Kristallnacht. It's the night of the broken glass.
It was carried out by members of the Nazi Party and their followers. This outbreak of violence led to the destruction of thousands of Jewish homes, businesses and places of worship. Almost 100 Jewish people were killed. After the events of Kristallnacht, the laws became stricter for the Jewish population. Jewish people had to close their businesses. Children were no longer allowed to attend public school.
The first boat arrived on the 2nd December 1938, and that was called the Prague. It was one of the Harwich Hook of Holland ferries. The first 200 refugees came from an orphanage in Berlin. What would they do with 200 children? The organisation in Liverpool Street Station hadn't been put into progress. So what did they do? They looked around for a large accommodation near to the arrival point from the Hook of Holland, which is Harwich Parks and Quay. It's about just under 2 miles from here. The holiday camp had closed for the winter, so it reopened. All the staff came back. The local manager there got all the staff and they looked after the children from there. So, and then the transports gradually came. Children need to be found housed. And it is reputed that people came on a Sunday when the children were sitting down for the Sunday lunch to sort of pick out which child they would actually take. Very, very sad when you think about it. It's just like going to a supermarket and picking which one you like. It tends to be some of the older boys didn't get chosen quite as often as the nice young children. And that went on and on. The holiday camp stayed open until the early spring. By that time, Liverpool Street had got their act together and the holiday camp closed. But that was our connection with the first Kindertransporter. The people of Harwich and Dovercourt, they came along and they took blankets, toys, anything to the holiday camp, because these poor children stayed in these chalets, thin skin, 4 bunk beds in each, toilets and showers at the end. The older girls they put one side and the older boys they put to the other side of the chalets, and that's how it carried on. The majority of the parish people were concerned that these children were in their area, and they probably said, what can we do to help? And to send stuff to the holiday camp. This is only a small town. In those days, we probably got about 8,000 or 9,000 people here, that's all.
With the locals helping with supplies and toys, and the holiday camp reopening, these children would have been well supported by Harwich locals before they were sent to the new homes in England. Their legacy lives on today through stories, remembrance, and monuments such as the Kinder Transport statue at the Harwich Docks.
We actually got together, some like-minded people in this town, because we wanted the statue the same as in Liverpool Street and the Hook of Holland. And we were successful in raising quite a lot of money. A lot came from the German government and the Austrian government. Lots of wealthy Jewish people contributed enough. The sculptor was Ian Walter, who lived Saffron Walden in north-east Essex there. Remarkable man. He used his children as a model so he could actually make them. There were 5 children on this. We actually managed to achieve it. I don't know how, but it happened.
In 1948, a ship named Empire Windrush landed here at Tilbury, and on board were men and women from the Caribbean that answered Britain's call to come and help rebuild the country after the Second World War. They arrived with just their suitcases, and they stepped into a country that probably didn't really welcome them to start with. But they worked hard, and with sheer determination they established their communities, and their legacy has resulted in our modern way of life here in Britain. And it all began here next to the Thames as they stepped off the ship onto the quayside.
The ship was called HMT Empire Windrush. It was built by the Germans as a cruise liner, taken in war and renamed by Britain. And then, in 1948, it became something else entirely, a vessel of hope. It left Jamaica with 1,027 passengers, and over 800 of them were from the Caribbean, answering Britain's call to come help rebuild. The war was over, the cities were rubble, and Britain needed workers, nurses, and hands. So it turned to its own colonies.
Britain needed workforce. Those soldiers that fought in the Second World War went back to their homelands. Remember, these are young men. Some of them never returned. The education system within most of the Caribbean countries and islands, they spoke the Queen's English. They were educated in British values. They knew more about Britain than they knew about their own countries. And when they got back to their countries and islands, remember, if Britain was part of the empire, these countries were part of the empire, their countries were in disarray as well. There was nothing there for them. From newspapers to radio articles to the movies that Britain needed people from the Caribbean diaspora. Doctors, nurses, builders, technicians, laborers, farmers, that all were needed for one or another purpose.
I was born in Jamaica, came to England when I was 9, 14th of November 1964. You know, we live in a very sort of middle-class neighbourhood in East Kingston. It's called Harbourview. All the houses were nice and new. I couldn't understand why we moved to England, really. Never got it. It was November, middle of winter, cold, snow. Everywhere, all the houses looked like factories because all the houses had chimneys and the smoke coming out all the chimneys before the days of central heating. yeah, grim, and sort of wondered why. Why did we leave like a nice house in Harbour View and come here? My major problems was at school. When I started school, I was probably the first black kid in my school. I had a lot of fights, almost every day. The cultural thing really kicked in more when you was a teenager and you started to face real racism as a teenager, because our generation was the first generation that had the stop and search, the sus laws, you know, and we might be just standing chatting and police would pull up on us and say, you know, oh, you're standing outside this shop, you know, you're suspected of planning to break into the shop or some stupidness like that they'd use, you know.
When that decision was made, £28, 10 shillings had to be paid to make that journey, paid to come to England. The Windrush ship picked those people up to come here. That's why you see them in their lovely suits and ties and dresses. It's because they came to support their Queenie. They were excited because they believed that Britain was full of kings and queens, prince and princesses, even dragons and fairies, a mystical place. I'm sure you've heard it was paved with gold. But then in reality, docking at Essex, Tilbury, on the 21st of June, but weren't allowed to come off the boats until their papers were actually stamped. When they saw the smoke coming out of chimney pots, when they saw the snow on the ground, when they felt the frosty welcome, all dressed up in their Sunday best, England, England is the place to be. England, England is the place for me. Well, that wasn't reality.
Born in Jamaica, 1932. Come to England, 1962. The problem is, as we know that every West Indian island are very poor. And when you grow up as a young man or a young girl, you want to lift, not down. So that's why we travel around, to get better in life. I find my 75 pounds and I come over here. So the last job that I done, I remember I earned 100 pounds. 21 days it take me to get here, you know, on the water, on the ship. I come here just was to spend 5 years to get myself high up in mason work. But through the place was so damn cold, I decided to work in a factory. Because when we first come over here, you know, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. So what we, the black people, do, we show a partner and help each other so that we could buy our own home.
Houses, up and down, knocking on doors for a room. They weren't welcome. Jobs that were available, they weren't welcome. Shops that they stood in the queue and other people would come in and they were served first. Going to school and being told, show me your tail. And the child was confused. What tail are you referring to? When you say to yourself, they didn't have to come. You're right, they didn't have to come. They came because they had a duty to Britain. They felt they had a duty to Britain, to build Britain up. And still, we were taught to keep the stiff upper lip. Seeing our parents take us to Sunday school, and we weren't really welcome. You had to create a house to have a place where you could worship, to keep your faith, until you could have a church of your own. To go to a bank to ask for a loan or to invest, and you weren't allowed. Welcome to Britain, welcome to Britain. On those cold, bleak days, when you left some beautiful islands. Remember, the servicemen were young in the Second World War who did not return. The countries, their islands were broken, and still they came again and again to support Britain. And we're here still now. That's what I say is resilience.
Migration is not just about history and things that happened in the past. It's something that's happening all the time. It's happening now every day. From 1948 onwards, when the Windrush generation arrived here with many others from the Caribbean, helping to rebuild Britain after the devastations of World War II, many of them, you know, settled in Essex communities. They worked in hospitals, they worked on transport, and they worked in factories. And their legacy is part of our way of life today. And also from a similar period, from 1950s, many families from India also decided to come to Britain, and many of them settled here in Essex. And of course, also many have come in more recent years, escaping from the horrors of war in the home countries. People, for example, from Afghanistan, Iraq and Ukraine, I mean, just to name a few. But many are successfully rebuilding their lives here in Essex.
I've been doing this work for around 10 years, and we used to see conflicts or wars break out, and it took 3 or 4 years before we would see people arrive in the UK. Now I would say it's a matter of weeks before we see people start to arrive. So very soon after Ukraine, Afghanistan, Eritrea, people started to arrive. So there is a much quicker impact when there are conflicts around the world on the countries nearby. I would just like to add that most people go to a neighbouring country, and in terms of people coming to the UK, we are the 17th in Europe on the list, so we're by no means first choice. So people generally filter down to coming to us 17th on the list. There's been a shift in terms of geographically, so we're getting more people through from South America, more people through from parts of Africa that previously not ever had conflicts, or not for many years. So there are always shifts and changes, but there are, I think traditionally more people will be coming from Middle Eastern countries, oil-rich countries. But we also deal with people who have been unable to assert their EU rights after we Brexited. So we have quite a large number of EU applicants who have to make resolution claims to the Home Office because they currently don't have the status that they should have.
I think the main challenges for refugees and migrants when they come to Colchester or come to the UK in general is the lack of an opportunity to immediately be able to learn English. That is sort of the key to giving them so many more choices. So in Colchester, we have an organisation that offers informal English classes 3 days a week. That's soon to become a 5-day-a-week opportunity for people to learn until they're entitled to have official ESOL lessons. So hopefully we bridge that gap through various organisations that we can refer into for that. So yeah, that is the main challenge. The second challenge is that an asylum seeker isn't allowed to work straight away. And it's a real shame because we've got some very, very highly skilled people that are sitting on their hands, and they feel so frustrated that they can't get on with the job that they've been trained to do, and they've dedicated their lives to training before they came to the UK, and then just have to wait. And it's heartbreaking to see sometimes. Yeah.
The main reasons people seek asylum are because of a war. The average person who comes to the UK has been internally displaced 8 times. So as you and I would, if there was a war or a conflict, or even be it a disaster, an environmental disaster, we'd move somewhere else. We'd try and go to family, maybe in Scotland or in Wales, and get away from where the trouble was. And people tend to do that 8 times before they actually decide to cross the border. When they cross the border, they normally will go to a neighbouring country, because more likely in the neighbouring country that people will speak your language or understand your language, maybe have the same currency, maybe eat the same food. it's more familiar, so they will try and go there because it's easier to find work and hopefully start again. Unfortunately, what happens is you get countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, who now have millions of people who've fled to their countries, and they literally, you know, some of those countries have a third of their population made up by refugees now. So there is a rise in xenophobia, but it's always there. I'm a migrant myself. I've experienced it since I was a child. I've never felt more empowered personally since I did this work. I feel much more at home sharing with other people how to feel at home in this country than I've ever done personally myself. I still get comments sometimes. There is a rise in xenophobia. I think that's to do with lots of political issues and financial issues and cost of living crisis and a general anxiety around upcoming anxieties around the climate, and people are looking at resources and knowing that they are scarce and getting scarcer, and they're worried. And when people worry about resources, they tend to become greedy about them. And unfortunately, greed is often at the back of a lot of xenophobia. This is mine, this land is mine, this food is mine. And if that's how we think, then we look for people to blame and we look for people to take these things from.
I think being a city of sanctuary would mean being a city where people feel welcome. There's a large community of people from abroad that come here, and they are happy to settle here. They're not just put here by the Home Office and just left. We don't believe that anybody should be in that situation where they're just left to their own devices. We wrap our arms around them and we give them that support here so that they feel welcome and feel part of the community.
Essex has never stayed still over its long history, with many communities deciding that they'd like to come and stay here. The Romans built their cities and towns, the Saxons carved out their kingdoms, and the cloth makers brought their cloth making skills to the country. And many people came here wanting to escape from the horrors of war. All of them brought their languages, their memories, their recipes, and everything with them. Essex doesn't just belong to one person. It belongs to everyone who's decided they'd like to make a home here. And this place, this county, this corner of England has always been welcoming to people who want to come and live here. And the story of Essex is about the story of its people, all of them.